Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us again on the program. I am Nifemi Oguntoye. It's now 7 days into the new year. Our time flies, right? Our attention is turned again to economic projections into 2025, and they say it's a global village, so the metrics are perhaps the same. We're going to be looking at the dynamics, the expectations, as well as the projections. There are quite a number of forecasts now, if you check online. Global growth in 2025, according to RSM, is expected to expand at a modest pace of about 2.5%. And they're saying that developed economies are expected to grow more slowly at 2%. What does that mean for Nigeria and indeed the continent? I'm joined by economist and the CEO of Cowrie Assets Management, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Good morning and thank you for coming.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Congrats on your new studio.
Well, it's good to change studios once in a while because I can't remember the last time I saw you physically. Many of our chats have been online, but thank you so much for joining us. Every year we hear that emerging markets, or economies rather, will grow more quickly, and that it is on this show that global growth will thrive. And that's what we're hearing again for 2025, even though they say that global growth is going to expand at some 2.5% across the world. What does that mean for Africa and Nigeria, especially in the new year?
You know, for Africa, you look at where there are the sectors or which countries or which regions are driving growth. And if you look at when they say that emerging economies will drive growth, that means countries like India, China, Brazil, where the country that will drive growth, and including the BRIC countries. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. It then means that the economy is expected to drive growth. But if you look at that BRIC countries, you have to look at which countries are going to drive growth. I think in the 2025 year, in year 2025, the major economy to drive growth is India. Obviously, if you talk of the emerging economies, then followed by China. China's growth had actually slowed to about in the region of 5%. But India is still growing above 7%. And India's economy has become, I think, the fourth largest economy in the world, or fifth largest economy in the world. So the size of the Indian economy actually is very strong. But how does it affect Nigeria? China accounts for more than 23% of our total imports. India is a major export economy to Nigeria. So you look at, if India is growing, then India will be demanding for crude from Nigeria. India will be demanding for basic imports it takes from Nigeria. So how would that affect us? If China is growing, it then means that supply chain for most equipment and Nigerian manufacturers import will also improve. So how that affects Nigeria. One, India is growing, then it then means that Nigeria's demand for Nigeria's exports should be strong enough or stronger than it was the previous year. And if China is growing, it then means our biggest import market is also expanding, which means that we should have easier access to the items or the materials we import from China.
There's also the dimension of trade tensions, the possibility of it escalating between the U.S. and its major commercial partners. There is a strong concern about what happens under the Trump economy in the coming days. The geopolitical tension has played a critical role in global economy. What way do you see it go this new year?
I think it's going to, like you rightly pointed out, it's going to intensify. If you consider the rhetorics of Donald Trump, the fact that Donald Trump does not even respect the natural friends of U.S., such as Canada, Germany, it then means for a country like China, he has considered as a foe, it's going to build more trade barriers. And it's very likely China will retaliate. But unfortunately for the U.S., they did not recognize that China has become a very big economy. That China does not... Yes, U.S. may still remain the biggest export market for China, but China can comfortably exist without U.S. because China has advanced its technology. If you look at what happened with Huawei, with battery-driven vehicles, that America is trying to do everything to forestall further development in China. But China has gone beyond that. And then China has already a huge local consumer market, which was not the case when China's expansion and economic growth started, where economy was basically export-oriented. At that point, if you shut down the export, or if you step on their export, then the economy would have suffered. Today, they have a huge consumer market. Remember that China has a population of about 1.4 billion people. So we are going to see the global economy, international trade is going to be constrained because US, which is the biggest economy in the world, is going to adopt a very strong nationalistic approach, and countries will respond accordingly. This is already affecting geopolitical politics. You can see Trudeau has resigned in Canada, and the Canadians are going to go for more central oriented. And
I heard Trump is asking that Canada should merge with America. I don't know how true that is. But are you also considering the fact that the China economy is showing signs of weakness? The second largest economy is struggling with real estate downturn. There is slowing consumer spending. You don't think that they are going to suffer more heat in the midst of a heightened geopolitical tension?
Yeah, absolutely. Their growth may slowed further beyond the 5% we saw last year. It could, but in the region of 4%, China's growth is still quite strong, given the size of the economy today. And they're doing the government is taking a lot of efforts to address the real estate crisis by granting some level of accommodation to that sector. The central bank is doing a lot to intervene in that sector to avoid a systemic deterioration of the real estate crisis into other segments of the economy. Of course, we are talking of slowing down in consumer spend is partly related to the real estate crisis. But ultimately, like I said, China has the benefit of size in terms of population. The US population is about 300 million. China is 4 times the population of US. And China's wealth has, in terms of per capita income, has expanded. Household income has expanded. But beyond that, there are also several regional economic powerhouses that are evolving. Brazil is there in South America. And then if you go down to Asia, you have the likes of Vietnam, all growing. So beyond exports to US, China is developing other export markets. Take, for instance, like I said, in Nigeria. Nigeria's total import, China accounts for more than 23% of Nigeria's total imports. So that alone, yes, our economy is not yet big, but assuming that becomes the trend across Africa, the African economy is more than $2 trillion, approaching $2 trillion. So if it gets $2 trillion, 25% of that, we are talking about 500 billion, then it to some extent offset part of what he would have lost in the U.S. From U.S. export.
So the Chinese foreign minister is currently visiting about 4 African countries, including Nigeria. They say this is perhaps the 35th consecutive year that the foreign minister will be choosing Africa as its first destination in the year. And we've seen quite a number of investments in infrastructure, between China and Africa, trade, tech, energy, and what have you. But are there downturns, drawbacks with this newfound love for the continent?
Well, some time. Yeah, there are always drawbacks for every excessive gift. Of course, if you have a child and you overfeed that child, the child becomes fat, obese. But beyond that, China has been extending a lot of support to African economies. Some of those have conditionalities attached to them. Where they don't have conditionalities, they become subject of graft and some inducement of corruption. But where they have conditionalities attached, we've seen instances where China has intervened to take over assets in some African countries that have defaulted. So there's a risk of default when it comes to massive infrastructure lending from China, particularly if those lending or the price of those lending were not effectively deployed. If they're effectively deployed into productive sector of the economy, they should be able to catalyze economic development, economic growth, so that they will earn the resources generated from those investments will eventually be used to pay China. But where there are major leakages from those proceeds, then you have situations, you have some countries where funds that came from China were not effectively or properly invested, and at the time when they're due for payment, repayment, they are unable to pay that. If you look at Nigeria's debt profile, apart from the World Bank Group, China is the largest lender to the economy. Of course, the amount we are borrowed from China is not enough to constrain our ability to pay back. But the reality is that China is extending so much credit to African economies. China sees the African economies as the next big thing that will happen in the world. Africa is the only region in the world that has no single fully developed sector of the economy. So that means every sector of the economy in Africa bodes strong growth prospects. And China is looking at today what's the population of Africa. Africa, we're talking about Africa is the fastest growing in terms of population. So we're talking of the next billion of Africans. So if Africa has a population of 2 billion, then that means Africa at some point in the next 20, 30 years, we have the population of China and India combined. And that means if the household income improves, that's where you're going to have the largest demand or consumer demand in the world. And that's what China is focusing on.
You think we haven't gotten to the point where we have to tread cautiously? Because, you don't have to owe them too much if you have growth potentials after all.
Well, I have it. My approach to it is that if I have a concessionary loan, that it comes at a very cheap cost, and I can effectively deploy it, it's very critical where you put that money in. If we borrow from China and build standard gauge rail from here across the country, the major economic corridors of the country that will kind of catalyze economic production, if we can borrow from China to invest on a power supply, if you can borrow from China to invest in a logistic infrastructure, the seaports, the airports, that will attract homebound manufacturing activities to the extent that we begin to export. From the export earnings, we should be able to pay China back. The problem is that if you borrow from China and invest in social infrastructure, you are using it to say you're improving the educational system, but actually there's no improvement. You invest in intangibles that is difficult for anybody to hold on to, and that you cannot effectively determine the output of that investment or the return from that investment. That's where the problem comes from. And that's the challenge we have. Like I said, some of the constraints that the Western economies have with just giving freebies to Africans is what China is doing to some people say entrap the leadership in Africa. But for a country like ours, where we have a reasonable level of knowledgeable people, and the key thing is that we must dimension what we're borrowing from China to do, and we must make sure that those funds are properly invested, we get value for money, and then they are invested in sectors that have the capacity to catalyze economic development.
So we're seeing some major realignment in the sub-region. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are now realigning with perhaps Russia, taking a break from the influence of France. That culminated in their exit from ECOWAS last year. What does this mean for, the sub-region? Even though the 3 countries are open to free visa, free entry, and what have you, do you see any significant economic impact in the new year?
Yes. Well, in the first place, these economies are not very strong, economies in Africa. Of course, they are neighboring countries, so that's how it affects us. Because any stability in those countries will affect the stability of our own country. But the basic thing is that Russia, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, is looking for allies and everywhere in the world. And the challenge with these Francophone African countries they have with France basically is what pushes them to Russia. Because they're looking for a country with a counterbalancing force that can neutralize or to some extent act as a deterrent to the forces of France. And the only country that will risk that is Russia. Of course, today China is obviously the second biggest economy in the world, probably the 3rd biggest army in the world, or the 3rd strongest army in the world. But China is not yet in the mode to act as a counterbalancing force against the US. So the only way direction these Francophone African countries could run to was to run to Russia.
To Russia.
But like I said, there are risks involved in every of this. Every action has benefits and risk. Some of the risk is that Russia has consistently shown to support alternative military forces in some countries, including having a very strong army for rent. Okay? So, and those armies for rent have been operating in Africa. So should Russia have strong investment in any of these Francophone African countries, and should they see this investment in jeopardy, they could take measures that are not democratic to ensure that, to make sure that they protect their investments.
And after all, they're using mercenaries, so they...
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to as
they can easily say, well, that's not us. Let's bring this home and talk about our local economy. Inflation has risen from 28% in November 2023 to 34% thereabout last year. CBN has also raised its policy rate by 875 basis points over the past 12 months to 27.5%. How do you see these indices impact on our economy in the new year?
Okay, the inflationary pressures we saw were basically driven by two major factors. One was the shortage of food supply as a result of insecurity in the major food base of the country, and then pass-through effect of exchange rate depreciation. You saw food inflation about 39.93% in November. Of the 4.6% inflation rate we had in November, food inflation was 39.93%. And the central bank had done a lot to mop up liquidity out of the economy to see if that could forestall the inflationary pressures. And I've always said that the inflationary pressure is not driven by excess credit expansion. Take, for instance, between January last year and December last year, central bank, through the issuance of open market operations instruments, OMO, through treasury-based issuance, through federal government bonds, through the DMO, took out from the economy about 31.3 trillion naira. But to counterbalance that liquidity withdrawal, FAC disbursed about 14.1 trillion naira as of November last year. So, in effect, what the central bank considered was taken out was about 16 trillion from the economy. But that did not stop or have a significant dampening effect on inflationary pressure. So I think the central bank have to retool its use of monetary tools, because if you look at every economic policy has multiple implications, and those implications are positive and negative. So you have to also weigh the negative implications of a monetary policy measure. I'll give you an instance. If you look at the expansion we saw in GDP of about 3.46% in the third quarter of last year, the major driver was telecommunications, which grew at about 5.3%. But that sector growth has actually moderated significantly over the years. So if you say you had grew about over 5%, you think it's that high, but this is a sector that was growing about 10%. But the key sector that drives the economy, manufacturing sector, grew at less than 1%. Trade sector grew at less than 1%. Then agricultural sector, which account about 28% of our GDP, almost 29% of our GDP, grew at 1.14%. Why are these sectors that should drive employment growing at such a slow rate? Because lending rates, as a result of CBN's efforts to mop up liquidity, had gone as high as 30%, 35%. In fact, if you go to most banks, the least they can lend to you is over 30%. Most of them are taking their prime lending rates in the region of 35%. So it becomes difficult for the real sector of the economy to thrive at such high interest rate environment. So the central bank policy to fight inflation, which has not succeeded effectively in fighting inflation, has had a major negative impact on the real sector of the economy.
What are you recommending that the Apex Bank does now?
It's going to be a combination of what the Apex Bank and the fiscal authority must do. And I've always said that there must be a harmony between the fiscal policies and monetary policies, because really one arm cannot do the job. They say you can't clap with one hand. Indeed. So the two hands must come together to clap. Like I said, why the central bank withdrew 31.3 trillion from the economy? The fiscal side injected 14.1 trillion. And of that 14.1 trillion, over 40% of it, or about 40%, was related to what they call exchange gain. So that additional from coming from exchange gain can be sterilized. We used to have what is called a screwed account. But where whatever difference between the budgeted exchange rate and the actual exchange rate, the market exchange rate, are shared, it leads to further liquidity injection. So they must have an arrangement where that amount is either sterilized or invested in infrastructure Infrastructure investment will mean it will create jobs immediately. It's attached to, before the funds are disbursed, there is a productive activity attached to it. But once you inject liquidity that is not backed by productive activity, it leads to liquidity suffix that have impact on inflation.
Let's take a short break. When we return, we'll have a conversation on economic projections for the new year. Stay with us, everyone.
Good morning, Marina Station and all the passengers. Efficient, it's comfortable.
This development will go a long way in reducing congestion and emission.
The trains are a long-term solution to Lagos traffic challenges.
This is where we take the final, decisions on policies, programs of government. I will have to ensure that, the narration of Lagos as a PLC is taken very, very seriously.
This is a major pedestrian bridge linking Oyinbo here to Apapa Road over there.
With this overpass, we are providing what we call permanent solution.
This place is one of the most dangerous areas at the biosecurity environment.
This can go into the news and every crumbs of your neighborhood.
Our goal is to remain as Africa's model megacity, to move our GDP from the 5-6 position to the 3rd position, and we believe it's achievable with all the commitments we have.
Explore the city of Lagos, where dreams are made and possibilities are endless. Amadedoja Salamadini, I live in Lagos, inside Lagos.
Thanks for staying with us, everyone. I'm here in the studio with CEO Carry Assets Management, Johnson Chukwu. Thank you very much for staying the course on the program. Some of your colleagues are talking about a great outlook for the exchange rate in the new year, and they are basing these assumptions on the fact that foreign reserve is now in the excess of $40 billion, the positive impact of the $2 billion Eurobond proceeds on reserves, impact of the dollar bond of about $500 million, and the import substitution effect of Dangote and the Port Harcourt refinery. Do you agree?
Yes, I believe that the pressures on exchange rate will moderate to some extent, not significantly, in the new year. The $40 billion we are talking of, bear in mind that I had mentioned earlier that we borrowed about 31 trillion naira from of that amount, only about 5.8 trillion was bonds, so they're talking of long-tenured instruments. So if you take out 5.8 trillion naira, you have borrowed over 23 billion or 24 billion from through treasury bills, 13 trillion naira from treasury bills. 24 trillion. 13 trillion naira was treasury bills, about 11 trillion naira was OMO. So these are short-dated instruments that will mature this year. So that amount was significantly funded by foreign portfolio investors. And that's why if you look at the $5.8 billion that came in by the first half of this year as for, capital importation, only $149 million was long-term investment, was foreign direct investment. The rest were either short-term loans or investment in money market instruments. So if you look at that, so you know that the 40 billion, significant part of it, of the increment, what has to do with hot money. So it's either we continue to issue treasury bills at high rates so that they can roll over those funds, or we must be prepared to see the reversal of those flow. And should that reverse, that means the reserve we're looking at, because the gross reserve we're looking at. So when you want to really determine your actual reserve, you have to look for the net reserve. So you look at what are those short-term payment obligations you have to make from these reserve that will draw down the reserve. So I think the reserve will come down unless the current monetary policy is sustained.
What do you consider the estimate net reserve as we speak?
It's difficult, but I don't think it will material above 20.
Wow. All right.
We've had figures bandied around by, I think, JP Morgan at some point, and that figure was less than 20 billion. But looking at that on the positive side, yes, import of petroleum products account for more than 25% of the total imports. PMS about 23% of the total imports. If you add AGO, about 9%, so you're talking about 30%. When you add the other derivative aviation fuel, which is about 1%. So ultimately, you have about 33% of the total import is a fine petroleum product. So ordinarily, one would expect that the coming on stream of Dangote refinery will mean that we're going to save about 33% of our total import. Yes, you could save that. But on the converse of it, that you are giving about 300,000 barrels a day to Dangote, or 350,000 barrels a day to Dangote. But that means of the 1.47 million barrels that you are producing, about 350 will go to Dangote. So part of your export earnings will also be constrained.
That's right.
So it's a zero-sum game. What we gain by saving from import of refined petroleum, we're going to lose from export of crude. Unless we materially increase crude production, which I think will happen with what has the finalization of the acquisition of Mobil by Seplat and the acquisition that was done by Oando. Yes. So I'm believing that along the line, in the course of the year, crude production will improve above the 1.47 million barrels we're currently running at. So that, for me, will be where the relief will come from, improvements in crude production. So I think that's what we should expect, but I don't think it's something that will happen in the first few months of this year.
But do you agree with the metrics for our spending plan in 2025, 1,500 naira per dollar? Do you see our exchange rate stabilize at that rate this year?
Well, a lot depends on what the fiscal and monetary authorities do. But is it feasible? Yes. Okay. Is it achievable? Yes. But I had talked about the central bank needs to sustain current monetary policy. Of course, I've already spoken about the negative implications of the current monetary policies. But if they sustain that and there is no major outflow for foreign portfolio investors, then we could have a stability in the exchange rate. And I don't think trade sector actually grew at 0.65% last year. I don't think there will be material improvement in the trade sector because there's no demand. Consumer demand is very weak. So the demand for FX driven by natural demand for import is weak. And we already talked about the benefit of substituting or displacing 33% of our imports as a result of Dangote refinery. So head or tail, if we manage our monetary policies well and we do not have major outflows from foreign portfolio investors, we should, the 1,500 is achievable.
Yeah. Let's open the phone lines and get views from the viewers as well. You can call on the line showing on your screen. You can also reach us via X. Remember to use the hashtag this morning, tag at TVC News NG and at Nifemi Oguntoye so I can get your tweets from here. Very interesting forecast. Mr. President is counting on increased food production to bring down inflation rate in the course of the year. The challenge with that, however, is that we heard from the governor saying we didn't do quite badly last year, but they noticed that most of the food crops are exported outside of the country to take advantage of the exchange rate. And then I think it was the Kwara State governor who said they've started building silos to hoard the food, in-house. What do you think is happening, and how can we deal with this?
I do not think. Yes, I read a report that said there is some improvement in export of food, export earnings, particularly non-oil export earnings, and it was coming from export of food. But what quantity of food are we exporting? I think it's consequential. Because if you look at export of food items, it's less than 1% of the total export. Yes, there's some improvement in some growth. But what we talk of food export, what Nigerians eat, it's basically tuber. An average household food consumption in the country is 70% of tuber, maybe 30% of grain. So if you talk of tuber, you're talking of cassava, you're talking of yam, you're talking of other tuber-related products, cocoyam and what have you. And then, if you go further, you talk of cereals, millets. Of course, millet is imported. You talk of corn, and you talk of rice. Reasonable production of rice is taking place now. But I don't see, I'm not aware that society is being exported. But the key thing is that if we allow such narrative to subsist, then we lose the essence of for us to focus on food production. We know there's a lot of displacement of farmers in the major food base of the country. That has not reversed. So we need to, and I'm happy to have read that there's a lot of funds being voted for security to the security arms of government so that they can fight the insurgency, the bandits that are displacing farmers in major food base of the country. That, for me, is a critical action that the government must do to improve food production. Ordinarily, for exporting food, it should excite the governors. And what they should do is how do we produce more food to export and diversify our foreign exchange earnings, which could happen in the near future. But the major challenge we have today is that food production is weak. The major food base of the country are the North Central, where the bandit, the herdsmen and the locals have been fighting for quite some time. A place like Benue used to be the food basket of the country. Many of the producers in Benue are in IDP camp. Southern Kaduna, I have friends who have massive farms. They are not producing their farm. It got as close as Edo, where commercial farms are abandoned because of what do you call it, the herdsmen. And then if you go to the northeast, you deal with issue of Boko Haram. You go to the northwest, you deal with the issue of bandits. So, and these are the major food base of the country. So if we are able to push back the level of insecurity in the country, then we should be able to improve on food production. Nigeria wasn't in this situation a couple of years back. It's something very strange that Nigeria has to partly rely on imports of food to...
Please hold that thought for a minute. Let me take George's call from Ikeja. Good morning, Mr. George.
And Nifemi, congratulations to TVC for your new state-of-the-art studio. We rejoice with you and we wish your company to grow from strength to strength. It's the only conversational station in the country that cares about what the people say. May you grow from strength to strength.
I
want to, talking about the economic outlook for 2025, I'm concerned about the refinery. We are hearing from certain places about attempts that some Nigerians thwart these efforts about the refineries working. I would want to advise the government to be on its alert.
Oh, I think we lost connection with Mr. George, but thank you for your contribution. He's exploring refineries and sabotage on the part of individuals. I think there are conversations as regards the former president and, you know, the status of the refineries. Even last year, some people were saying that the Port Harcourt refinery wasn't working. We saw, you know, organized labor taking a tour and saying, well, this place is working. We're hearing from the federal government also that Warri is working at 60%. Hopefully Kaduna comes upstream this year. But what do you make of the concerns of sabotage in this regard?
When you talk of sabotage, you're talking of sabotage by people who are saying the refineries are not working, or people who are constraining crude production into the refinery, to the refineries, I mean crude supply to the refineries. Because a lot of time when we talk of sabotage, if I hold a contrary opinion, it doesn't amount to sabotage. If I have information that is not available to the public, and I think the public is being fed with information that is contrary to what I know, and I present it, it doesn't amount to sabotage. It's a contrary opinion. So I don't know what the position, what they are calling sabotage. What I know is that Kaduna Refinery needs crude supply from the Warri axis, Escravo axis. That crude pipeline is not functioning. So even when if you fix Kaduna Refinery, you are likely going to end up with no crude supply. I also know that the Warri refinery has a challenge with crude supply. I also know that a report that was commissioned by Obasanjo's government for the reactivation of the refinery indicated that the FCCD were obsolete. There's a few cracking catalytic devices were obsolete. I don't know if that had been scrapped and replaced with modern FCCD. I also know that these technologies on which these refineries were built have largely become outdated. So they are not going to be as efficient. I'm also aware that in the public space that the former Minister of State for Petroleum, Chukwu, had made commitment to the country severally that was going to get this refinery to work. And at the end of the day, he ended up saying that the outfront from the refineries the value of the outfront from the refinery were less than the value of the input, the crude that was fed into the refinery. So in effect, if you fed in a crude that worth $100, what came out as a refined petroleum product was less than $100 equivalent. And he said that. So I don't know if those things have changed. Yeah. I know the government has invested further and turning around the refineries, how rebuilding them. But we will be glad to see the refineries working. We are all, it's in our likely self-interest that the refineries are working. But if anybody holds a contrary opinion, it is not to take people on a tour that will resolve it. What will resolve it is for those refineries to start. They're like today, people are going to Dangote to load refined petroleum products. Once people start loading refined petroleum products from those refineries,
it is going to be very difficult for anyone to gainsay the effectiveness of what's happening there. But let's move on to some other projections. The IMF, for instance, is projecting 3.2% economic growth in the year. And it's saying that inflation will drop to 25%, a further decline to 14% by 2029. I remember, I think we had a conversation a few days ago about the projection in the 2025 budget, about 15% inflation rate in the new year. This is saying that we can get there in another 4 years. What does that mean?
You know, the government has the tendency to be very optimistic in their projections. If you look at the assumptions underlying the 2025 budget, most of the basic assumptions are quite optimistic, starting from crude production about 2.06 million barrels a day, which for me looks like too much of a tall order. I mentioned earlier that third quarter, crude production was about 1.47 million barrels a day. Second quarter was 1.41 million barrels a day. So how are you going to jump to about increase by about 600,000 barrels a day? I think that's going to be very tall order. So on that basis, because like I said to you, a lot will depend on our foreign exchange earnings to moderate pass-through effect of exchange rate depreciation. The other factor is food production. So if the government makes projections that are very optimistic, then it then means that the GDP growth rate of about 4.5 or so percent they are projected will be very tall. If you look at inflation, the factor driving inflation I'd mentioned is exchange, the pass-through effect of exchange rate and high food inflation. Are we going to change those things? What will materially change? Food production has to get to the point that when you go to the market, the people who are selling food will be begging for you to buy. So if we don't get to that point, then we are still, even if government fights insecurity, it's not going to be a light bulb effect. You're not going to just get there and then they will all vanish. It will be a gradual process of winning back those communities and villages. So that means you're not going to have full...
But do you agree that we've seen some gains in the outgone year? I remember having a conversation with the Kaduna State Governor who mentioned that in the past 8 months thereabout, there hasn't been any form of abduction in the state, and that is employed non-kinetic efforts, giving amnesty to bandits. The military is also saying that at least there's a long list of bandit leaders that have now been neutralized. Do you think there is a carryover effect from 2024 to 2025, and that we're not just starting from scratch in the new year?
I think, no, we're not starting from scratch. I think there'll be some gains. But I think the governor's statement, I'm not here to contradict because I don't have the data to contradict him, but I also am aware that there's a publication that talked about how much was paid at ransom.
About 2.2 trillion. 2
trillion. How many people were kidnapped, how many people were killed last year. So that information has to be disaggregated to make sure that none of them had to do with Kaduna. So I don't want to go into that. But the reality is that, of course, there's some improvement. Like I said, the key thing about winning a war of the nature we have, non-conventional warfare, where you don't have the camp of the enemy force, where you say, look, I have to bomb them, I have to deploy cannons and other things. It's a difficult war to win. What I'm just saying is that we are not likely going to see a full eradication of the bandits, the conflict between the settlers and the headers and the Boko Haram people. You're not going to see a complete victory in a single year. So that means people going back to their family. Remember, there's also a family season. Before you even make so much of those gains, the family season may have gone past. So, but in effect, back to what we're saying, the thing is that if you do not to the region of 1,500, you are not likely going to see inflation moderate to 10%. So I think the IMF, the projection about 25% look more realistic. But I also want to start a caveat, because when we talk of inflation is going to moderate to 25%, people believe that it simply means prices will come down by 25%. No. The reality about inflation moderating is that if prices last year, December, if the price of a bag of rice was 100,000 last year, December, and you're talking about inflation rate of 25% this year, it then means that a bag of rice will be 125,000 naira. So people have to get that. So they also need to know that their income, personal household income, needs to improve by the rate higher than the rate of inflation for them to even continue with their current standard of living. And that's what people don't understand. When we say inflation will moderate to from 34.6% to 25%, it then means that the prices will increase further, not by 34%. And remember, you also have to what you call the base effect. The base effect means that if prices were 70,000 naira per bag of rice last year, an increase of 100,000 meant about 35% increase, which is the inflation rate we are dealing with. So if you increase it by another 30,000 from 100,000, it is no longer 35%, it's going to be 30%. Because the base is higher. The base is now 100,000. So we're saying, and that's what we call the base effect. The base effect means when prices are increasing from a higher base, the magnitude, irrespective of the magnitude of the increase, the percentage increase will be lower because you are talking of a higher denominator. And even if the numerator is still the same, I mean, simple arithmetic. So we must bear that in mind. But I think a 15% projection by the federal government is quite optimistic. Like I said earlier, a lot of the projections are quite optimistic. Crude price at about $75 is optimistic. Today, crude is doing about $73. And everybody expects that once assumes office on 20th of January, is going to take measures to further reduce crude prices. So even the government budgetary revenue of about 88 trillion is also quite optimistic. We are projecting about 19.6 trillion from earnings from crude, from oil. It's still optimistic. Of November, at the end of August or so, we had only earned about 4.6 trillion. So if you look at that, everything about the government's business is to give us confidence. The government business is to give us hope. So
renewed version of it.
So when we hear these pronouncements that are indicative of giving us hope, the government cannot tell you the whole world is coming to an end.
But what is the current global inflation rate so that we don't have this conversation in isolation? And what do you consider the global benchmark in this regard?
Okay. If you look at the countries like US, the US targets about 2% inflation. The UK is about the same region, 2% inflation for the year, annual inflation. The countries, our governments are targeting about 15%. And you have to look at the fact that we've seen moderation in inflation in Western countries, because those factors that led to major uptick in inflationary pressure in their country were triggered by the Russian-Ukraine war. High cost of wheat, inability to get wheat, high cost of oil, and the energy input. Those things are moderating. So we've seen consistent moderation in Western economies' inflation rates. Even a country like Ghana has seen some moderation in inflation rate, but the pressures that drive inflation differ from country. Our own pressures are local, they are endogenous to us.
So I'm just wondering, what alternatives do you think are there for government? Because Mr. President was clear to have said, you know what, I'm not going to control price. We'll rather focus on increasing supply and allow the market forces do its thing.
Well, everything I've said have centered around increasing supply. I talked about pushing back the negative forces, sources of insecurity in the major food base of the country to drive down to drive down insecurity and drive up food production. That's about supply. I talked about increasing crude supply beyond the 1.47 million barrels recorded in the third quarter of this year to improve our foreign exchange earnings. And the foreign exchange earnings improvement will lead to lower exchange rates. Lower exchange rate would reverse the pass-through effect of naira depreciation. So, and that, all those two factors will drive down inflation. So the key thing is that I've always been an advocate that price control never works. It drives the product into the alternative market or the parallel market or the black market, as you may call it in some places, where they are sold beyond what they would have sold in the free market. So when you try to control price, like what they did, if you recall, the government said they're going to sell a bag of rice for how much? Was it 25,000 or 30,000 or so at the local governments? What eventually happened? Those who were saddled with the responsibility of selling those rice basically found a way of passing it on to people who had to resell it and share the benefit with them. And eventually those rice that were sold for 30,000 or whatever price the government fees came back to the market at 100,000. Because it's impossible to control price where supply is materially below demand. So that, for me, I am a free market economic thinker. I believe that free markets are always better for any economy. Of course, with some moderations, with some strong controls to check abuses. So I've never been an advocate to say, look, you need to control price. It never works.
But are there expectations, because in the past year, the first and second quarter, we saw what appears GDP growth rates 2.98% and 3.19%, but it still did not impact directly on inflation and naira depreciation. Are there expectations that if this is sustained, we'll see some relative impact in the new year?
No, you have to look at what those factors driving growth. I did mention to you that of the major hitters, the top largest contributor of the economy, the only one that grew materially was the telecommunications sector. And if you look at the nature of their output, it does not have dampening effect on inflation. The other major driver, which I think is the sixth contributor to the economy, is the financial services sector. Because if you look at the order of contribution, you have the agricultural sector, followed by telecommunication, followed by trade, followed by manufacturing, followed by oil and gas, and then the financial services sector. That grew about 30%. So the sixth largest contributor to the economy grew about 30%, but their contribution is just about 5.4%. 5.4 or 5.5% to the GDP. And their output also do not have material impact on inflation. So this factor that would have a material impact is agriculture, with 8.9% of the GDP in terms of contribution, but grew by 1.14%. You have trade sector. Trade sector accounts for about almost 15% of the GDP. It grew by 0.65%. You have the manufacturing sector, about 8% of the GDP, grew by 0.9%. So these are factors that would drive down inflation if they are growing strongly.
We have to go now. By the way, telcos want 100% increase in... I don't think government is going to give them that. In 30 seconds, you want to comment?
I think I've seen a report that said the government has approved 40% increase. But the reality is that government has approved increases in prices of everything that had to do with exchange rate and inflation rate, including service provided the government. The government has no moral justification to hold back that sector that is driving other sectors of the economy and allow it to collapse.
Mr. Johnson Chukwu, thank you so much for coming. CEO, Carry Assets Management. Happy New Year to you. And good to see you again.
Thank you. When are we watching this new studio?
We're watching with water. That's our show today. Thanks for being a part of it. The conversation continues online at Nifemi Oguntoye. See you again tomorrow.